The air feels heavier here, as if it still remembers kings and conquerors. The scent of sun-baked mud brick rises from these ancient foundations. The Tigris flows just beyond, slow and eternal, the same river that nourished a modest settlement called Asher nearly 4,500 years ago. These crumbling walls, these weathered stones beneath a golden sky, once formed the spiritual heart of the most feared empire the ancient world ever produced. This is Assyria. What began here, on this western bank of the Tigris at a place now known as Kalat Sherkat, was not born from conquest. It was born from trade. Merchants loaded donkey caravans with tin and finely woven textiles, guiding them across more than 1,000 kilometers of highland passes into Anatolia, to a colony called Karum Kanesh. Over 23,000 clay tablets discovered there reveal their contracts, their family letters, their disputes over silver and gold. These were not warriors. They were businessmen. And yet, from this mercantile beginning, something extraordinary emerged. A civilization that would forge iron weapons when its enemies still wielded bronze. A state that would raise colossal winged bulls carved from single blocks of limestone, standing guard at palace gates. An empire whose kings commanded armies numbering perhaps 200,000 soldiers, equipped with siege engines, cavalry, and a machinery of terror that no rival could withstand. Together, we will journey from the very beginning of this civilization to its final, devastating end. We will walk through the trading colonies of the old Assyrian period, witness the kingdom's survival under foreign domination by Mitanni and Babylon, and stand beside Ashurbanipal I as he writes to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten as an equal. We will watch Tukulti-Ninurta I carry the stolen statue of Marduk from conquered Babylon back to Ashur. We will see the Neo-Assyrian war machine unleashed under Ashurnasirpal II, explore his magnificent palace at Nimrud, where he hosted a banquet for nearly 70,000 guests. We will read the Bronze Gate bands of Balawat, witness the fall of Samaria and the end of the kingdom of Israel in 722 before Christ, and marvel as Sennacherib transforms Nineveh into the greatest city on earth, with 12 kilometers of walls and a palace lined with over 2 kilometers of carved alabaster reliefs. We will enter the library of Ashurbanipal, where over 30,000 cuneiform tablets preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh and the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamia. And we will stand in silence as floodwaters breach the walls of Nineveh in 612 before Christ, and an empire that terrorized the known world for centuries vanishes in flame and ruin. This is not just a history lesson. This is a complete journey through time. From the earliest temple of Ishtar at Ashur to the modern restoration of the Mashki Gate, from ancient cuneiform king lists recording rulers who lived in tents to the Assyrian communities who still speak Aramaic today, every chapter of this story will unfold. What makes this journey matter beyond the ancient past is profound. The administrative systems Assyria invented, provincial governance, royal road networks, intelligence services, became the blueprint for every empire that followed. Persia borrowed them. Rome refined them. The very architecture of imperial power traces back to these dusty plains of northern Mesopotamia. Some of the greatest mysteries of human achievement are hidden in these stones. By the end of this series, the full arc of Assyrian civilization will be clear. Not just what happened, but how an entire world rose from a riverbank trading post, commanded nations from the Nile to the Zagros Mountains, and then collapsed so completely that its greatest cities lay buried and forgotten for over 2,000 years, until a man named Layard drove his shovel into the earth at Nimrud in 1845. If you enjoy these complete journeys through ancient civilizations, please subscribe so you do not miss our next exploration. Each week we bring you the full story of a lost world, told with the care and detail it deserves. Now, let us begin our journey at the banks of the Tigris, where a small settlement is about to change the course of human history. The Tigris moves slowly here, brown and heavy with silt, curving westward through a landscape of low limestone bluffs and dry steppe grass that stretches to the horizon. Northern Mesopotamia is not the lush river delta of the south, where the great cities of Sumer rise from marshland. This is harder country. The rain falls in winter and spring, enough to coax barley and emmer wheat from the earth without irrigation, and the river itself serves less as a lifeline for farming than as a road, a corridor connecting the mountains of the north to the alluvial plains below. Sometime around 2,500 years before the Common Era, a settlement takes root on a rocky promontory along the western bank, at a point where the river bends and the bluff offers natural defense on 3 sides. The place is called Asher, after the god who dwells there, or perhaps the god takes his name from the place. The two are inseparable from the very beginning. The earliest structures are modest. Mud brick walls, sun-dried and pale against the brown earth, define small rectangular rooms. The foundations sit directly on bedrock in places, and the settlement clusters tightly on the promontory, its back to the river. There is no grand palace, no monumental gate. What distinguishes Asher from countless other villages along the Tigris is something less visible, but more enduring: its position. To the east, mountain passes lead toward sources of copper and tin. To the north and west, routes stretch across the Jazira steppe toward Anatolia and its silver. Southward, the river carries goods toward Babylon and beyond. Asher sits at a crossroads, and crossroads breed commerce. The earliest sacred structure that archaeology can identify is the Temple of Ishtar, goddess of war and desire, built and rebuilt on the same spot for nearly 2,000 years. Its oldest layers reveal simple mud brick platforms and offering deposits, fragments of pottery and small clay figurines left by worshippers whose names are lost entirely. Nearby, on the highest point of the promontory, the temple of the god Asher himself will eventually rise, though its earliest phases remain buried beneath centuries of later construction. These temples anchor the settlement. They give it identity, continuity, a reason to endure when other villages along the Tigris are abandoned and forgotten. The Assyrian king list, a remarkable document copied and recopied by scribes across 1,000 years, reaches back into this dim era with a haunting phrase. It names the earliest rulers as kings who lived in tents, 17 in number, whose fathers are recorded but whose deeds are not. These are perhaps semi-nomadic chieftains, leaders of a community not yet fully settled, moving between pasture and the growing town on the bluff. The list preserves their names with care, linking each generation to the next in an unbroken chain that later Assyrian kings will treat as sacred legitimacy. Even in this earliest form, the impulse to record, to anchor identity in documented succession, is already present. The site known today as Kalat Sherkat in northern Iraq preserves what remains. Excavations begun by German archaeologists in the early 1900s revealed layer upon layer of occupation, the deepest levels yielding the mud brick bones of this first settlement. The land around it is quiet now, windswept and dry, but the strategic logic of the location remains legible. The bluff still commands the river. The routes still converge. In this unremarkable landscape, beside this slow brown river, a civilization is taking its first breath. The god Asher watches from his hilltop, and the merchants and farmers and tent-dwelling kings who serve him do not yet know what their small city will become. But the foundations are laid, brick by careful brick, and the king list grows longer with each generation, recording a continuity that will outlast empires not yet imagined. 5 centuries pass, and the small city on the bluff has learned something that no army could teach it. Asher has learned to count. It has learned to weigh silver against tin, to calculate the profit on 40 bolts of textile carried across 1,200 kilometers of mountain and steppe, and to record every transaction on small clay tablets pressed with a reed stylus and sealed inside clay envelopes bearing the impression of a cylinder seal. By the 20th century before the Common Era, Asher has become the center of the most sophisticated long-distance trading network the ancient world has ever known. The enterprise begins with 2 commodities. Tin arrives from the east, likely from sources in the Iranian plateau, or perhaps as far as modern Afghanistan, funneled through intermediary markets into Asher's warehouses. Woven textiles, fine fabrics produced by women in Assyrian households, are bundled alongside the metal. Both are loaded onto donkeys, each animal carrying roughly 60 kilograms divided into standardized packs. The caravans depart Asher and move northwest, crossing the Tigris, climbing through the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, and descending into the high Anatolian plateau. The journey takes 6 weeks or more. At the end of the road lies Kanesh, a thriving Anatolian city near modern Kultepe in central Turkey, where a dedicated merchant quarter, the Karum, sprawls outside the citadel walls. The Karum at Kanesh is not a fortress or a colony in the imperial sense. It is a commercial district, a neighborhood of mud brick houses where Assyrian merchant families live, sometimes for generations, among the local Anatolian population. They intermarry. They raise children who speak both languages. But their business records are kept in Assyrian cuneiform, and their legal disputes are adjudicated according to the customs of Asher. The tin and textiles arriving from the south are exchanged for silver and gold at ratios carefully established by supply and demand. A shekel of tin might fetch 14 or 15 shekels of silver in a good season. The profits are extraordinary. More than 23,000 cuneiform tablets have been excavated from the Karum at Kultepe, and they reveal a world of startling modernity. Business partnerships are formalized in written contracts, specifying investment shares, profit distribution, and liability. Letters travel back and forth between Kanesh and Asher, wives writing to husbands about textile production quotas, fathers instructing sons on market conditions, creditors demanding repayment. The tablets record lawsuits over broken agreements, complaints about the quality of merchandise, and meticulous accounting of debts owed and payments received. This system flourishes under rulers like Ereshum I, who establishes policies of free trade, abolishing certain taxes on goods moving through Asher's markets. The city thrives not through conquest, but through commercial law, trust networks, and the enforceability of written contracts. At least 40 trading stations spread across Anatolia, forming a web of Karum and smaller outposts called Wabatum, all connected to the mother city on the Tigris. The merchant houses of Ashur operate with a sophistication that will not be matched in Europe for 3,000 years. They use credit instruments. They ensure shipments against loss. They maintain agents in distant cities who act on their behalf, empowered by written authorization. The donkey caravans move through territories controlled by local Anatolian kings who permit the trade in exchange for taxes, creating a mutually beneficial system that enriches everyone along the route. Yet this golden age of commerce is not permanent. By the 18th century, before the Common Era, shifting political conditions in Anatolia and the rise of new powers in Mesopotamia disrupt the trade networks. The Karum at Kanesh is destroyed and rebuilt, then eventually abandoned. The tablets fall silent, buried under centuries of dust. But the skills these merchants perfected, contract law, accounting, credit, long-distance logistics, have seeped into the institutional memory of Ashur. The city has proven that it can project its influence across vast distances, binding distant peoples into systems of mutual obligation. When the time comes to project a different kind of power, the administrative architecture will already exist. The shadow arrives from the south. Around 1760, before the Common Era, Hammurabi of Babylon, having unified the river plains under a single legal and military authority, extends his dominion northward. Ashur, for all its commercial sophistication, commands no army capable of resisting the most powerful ruler in Mesopotamia. The city on the bluff becomes a subject territory, its kings reduced to vassals who acknowledge Babylonian supremacy. The trade colonies in Anatolia have already fallen silent. The caravans no longer depart. Ashur stands diminished, enclosed within its own walls, a city that once reached across 1,000 kilometers of mountain and steppe now contracted to the sound of its own prayers. But Hammurabi's empire proves brittle. Within a generation of his death, Babylon's grip weakens and new powers fill the vacuum. From the northern mountains and the rolling grasslands beyond the upper Euphrates come the Hurrians, a people whose language belongs to no known family, whose warriors ride spoke-wheeled chariots with a mastery that transforms warfare across the ancient world. By roughly 1500 before the Common Era, the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni dominates the entire sweep of northern Mesopotamia from the Mediterranean coast to the Tigris foothills. Ashur falls firmly within this orbit, its kings serving at the pleasure of Mitanni overlords who command from their capital at Washukani, a city whose exact location remains unknown even to modern archaeology. The fortified walls of Ashur still stand during these centuries, repaired and maintained, but no longer symbols of independent power. Mitanni chariots patrol the plains to the north and west, their lightweight vehicles carrying composite bows and bronze-tipped arrows that make them the supreme military technology of the age. Assyrian kings appear on the king list in unbroken succession, each name carefully recorded, each reign measured and preserved. This continuity is not accidental. It is an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to let the thread of identity snap even when political autonomy has vanished. At the heart of this endurance stands the temple of the god Ashur, rising from the highest point of the rocky promontory above the Tigris. The inner sanctum remains active through every decade of foreign domination. Priests perform the ancient rituals, maintain the sacred calendar, and tend the cult statue of the deity, who shares his name with the city itself. This fusion of divine and civic identity creates something remarkably resilient. To worship Ashur is to affirm the city. To maintain the temple is to insist that the city's story has not ended. The god does not belong to the conquerors. He belongs to this specific place, this limestone bluff, this bend in the river. The centuries of subjugation leave their marks in subtler ways. Hurrian names appear among Assyrian officials. Mitanni artistic motifs influence local craftwork. Administrative practices from the overlord kingdom filter into Ashur's bureaucratic traditions. The city absorbs what is useful from its masters while preserving what is essential about itself. Clay tablets from this period are scarce compared to the abundant archives of the merchant era, but those that survive reveal a society maintaining its scribal traditions, its legal frameworks, its temple economies. 350 years pass under foreign shadows. Generations are born, live, and die, knowing no independent Assyrian state. Yet the institutional memory persists in the temple archives, in the king list that stretches backward into the deep past, in the rituals performed at the same altars where offerings were made before any Babylonian or Hurrian army appeared on the horizon. Ashur waits, not passively, but with the patience of a city that has already survived the collapse of its commercial empire and understood that power takes many forms. The god endures. The list of kings grows longer, and far to the west, the Mitanni kingdom begins to fracture under pressure from Hittite aggression and internal rivalries, creating cracks through which a reassembled Assyrian ambition will eventually force its way into the light. The cracks widen. Through the middle decades of the 14th century before the Common Era, the Mitanni kingdom that had held Assyria in subordination for generations begins to tear itself apart. Hittite armies press from the west, shattering Mitanni's hold on northern Syria. Internal succession disputes fracture the royal court at Washukani, and in the ancient city on the Tigris bluff, a king ascends who understands precisely what this moment means. Ashurbanipal I takes the throne of Ashur around 1363 before the Common Era, and with him begins a transformation so complete that nothing afterward will resemble what came before. He is not content to be a vassal. He is not content to be a regional lord paying tribute to weakening overlords. The inscriptions he commissions speak in a new voice, one that claims equality with the greatest powers of the age. The evidence survives in the dry sands of a place far from Mesopotamia. At Amarna in Egypt, in the diplomatic archive of the pharaoh Akhenaten, a clay tablet catalogued as Letter 16 preserves Ashurbanipal's correspondence with the Egyptian court. He addresses the pharaoh as brother. He sends a royal chariot, 2 horses, and a date stone of genuine lapis lazuli as gifts. He requests gold in return, noting pointedly that gold in Egypt is as plentiful as dust. The tone is confident, even demanding. This is not the language of a minor tributary. This is the language of a king who considers himself the equal of Egypt, Babylon, and the Hittite realm. The Babylonian king Burnaburiash II protests furiously to Akhenaten, insisting that the Assyrians are his subjects and should not be received as independent rulers. The protest goes unheeded. Ashurbanipal has already changed the diplomatic reality on the ground. He marries his daughter to the Babylonian crown prince, entangling Assyrian blood with the oldest royal house in Mesopotamia. When that prince is murdered in a palace coup, Ashurbanipal marches south and installs a new king on the Babylonian throne by force. It is the first time in recorded history that an Assyrian army intervenes decisively in Babylonian affairs. Within Ashur itself, the physical landscape transforms. The old mud-brick walls are strengthened and extended. The temple of the god Ashur receives new foundations, its sacred precinct enlarged to reflect the growing ambitions of the state it embodies. Royal inscriptions appear carved not on perishable clay, but on enduring stone, intended to speak across centuries. The administrative apparatus expands as new territories along the upper Tigris come under direct Assyrian control, their grain harvests and labor forces feeding a growing military infrastructure. Ashurbanipal's successors build upon what he began. Enlil-nirari and Arik-Denili campaign against Babylonian border regions and mountain peoples to the east. Each reign adds territory, consolidates administrative control, extends the network of roads and outposts that bind the expanding state together. The fertile triangle between the Tigris, the upper and lower Zab rivers, becomes the agricultural heartland of a kingdom that now stretches well beyond the walls of its founding city. By the turn of the 13th century before the Common Era, Assyria stands recognized among the great powers of the late Bronze Age world. Its kings exchange gifts and treaties with Egypt, negotiate boundaries with the Hittites, and challenge Babylon with increasing confidence. The old trading city has become a territorial state with professional soldiers, appointed governors, and a royal ideology that frames expansion as the will of the god Ashur himself. The transformation is remarkable in its speed. Within 3 generations, Assyria moves from vassalage to sovereignty, from obscurity in the diplomatic record to a seat at the table of empires. The temples still stand where they have always stood. The rituals continue in their ancient cadence, but the city that performs them has become something entirely new. The kingdom is reborn not through revolution, but through the precise exploitation of a collapsing regional order, seized by rulers who understood that the patience of centuries had finally earned its reward. The patience has earned more than reward. It has earned appetite. Through the 13th century before the Common Era, 3 successive kings transform Assyria from a regional power into something the ancient world has not yet seen. A state whose fundamental purpose is conquest, whose ideology demands expansion, whose gods march with its armies into foreign lands. Adad-nirari I inherits the momentum his predecessors built and drives it outward with deliberate force. He campaigns westward across the Euphrates, subduing territories that Mitanni once held unchallenged. His royal inscriptions adopt a new tone, sharper than anything Ashurbanipal had permitted himself. He styles himself king of everything, great king, and in correspondence with the Hittite court he demands recognition as a peer. The Hittite king objects. Adad-nirari persists. Assyrian armies now operate across distances that would have been unthinkable 2 generations earlier, and the administrative apparatus grows to match. Governors dispatched to hold conquered lands, garrisons planted in strategic towns, tribute schedules enforced with methodical precision. His son Shalmaneser I pushes further still. He campaigns into the Hurrian highlands, destroying the remnants of Hanigalbat, the rump state of old Mitanni. His inscriptions record the blinding of 14,400 captured enemy soldiers, a number preserved in cuneiform with bureaucratic exactness. He founds the city of Nimrud, known then as Kalhu, along the Tigris south of the upper Zab River. The site will wait centuries for its greatest glory. but its selection reveals strategic thinking of remarkable foresight. Shalmaneser also rebuilds the Temple of Ashur in the capital, expanding its precinct, reinforcing the theological architecture that binds military victory to divine favor. Then comes Tukulti-Ninurta I, and with him the Middle Assyrian kingdom reaches its most extraordinary and most dangerous peak. He ascends the throne around 1243 before the Common Era, and immediately proves himself a campaigner of relentless energy. He strikes north into the mountains, defeating coalition armies of Nairi lands beyond the upper Tigris. He pushes into territories no Assyrian king has touched, but his defining act lies southward. Around 1225 before the Common Era, Tukulti-Ninurta marches on Babylon. The Kassite king Kashtiliash IV meets him in battle and is defeated, captured, brought in chains to Ashur. The Assyrian army enters Babylon and commits an act of extraordinary symbolic violence. The statue of Marduk, supreme god of Babylon, lord of the Esagila temple, is seized and carried north to Ashur. In Mesopotamian theology, this is not mere plunder. It is the capture of a god, the subjugation of cosmic order itself. Babylon's divine protection has been physically removed. Tukulti-Ninurta commemorates his triumph with an epic poem composed in his honor, narrating the war as divinely ordained, portraying the Kassite king as an oath-breaker whom the gods themselves condemned. He rules Babylon directly for years, appointing governors, extracting its wealth. At home, he undertakes an act almost as audacious. Across the Tigris from ancient Ashur, on the eastern bank, he constructs an entirely new capital, Tukulti-Ninurta. Its walls rise from virgin ground, its palaces feature painted interiors with geometric patterns in red and blue. Its temples honor Ashur in freshly consecrated precincts. The message is unmistakable. This king considers himself the founder of something new, a ruler whose achievements demand a city bearing his name. Yet the new capital also signals something troubling, a king separating himself from the ancient institutions of Ashur, from its priesthood, from its established nobility. The painted walls of Tukulti-Ninurta shelter a court growing isolated. Babylon eventually slips from Assyrian control. The Kassite dynasty recovers Marduk's statue. Provincial loyalty phrase. Around 1208 before the Common Era, Tukulti-Ninurta I dies not in battle, but in his own palace, killed in a conspiracy led by his own son. The new capital is abandoned almost immediately, its painted rooms left to the wind and the slow accumulation of dust. The city across the river, ancient Ashur, reclaims its primacy as though the experiment never happened. The pattern established here will echo through Assyrian history for centuries. The intoxication of conquest, the monumental ambition, the construction of new capitals as statements of personal power, and the violent correction that follows when a king overreaches the bonds that hold the state together. The world that Tukulti-Ninurta I had known begins to unravel within decades of his murder. Across the entire eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, a catastrophe unfolds that no single cause can explain. The Hittite Empire, Assyria's great rival in Anatolia, collapses entirely. Its capital Hattusa burns and is abandoned around 1180 before the Common Era. The Mycenaean palace centers of Greece fall silent. Ugarit, the cosmopolitan port on the Syrian coast that had linked copper traders and scribes across civilizations, is destroyed and never reoccupied. Egypt survives but barely, repelling waves of displaced peoples its scribes call the Sea Peoples, confederations of migrants whose origins remain debated, but whose destructive passage is undeniable. The interconnected Bronze Age world, sustained by long-distance trade in tin, copper, grain, and luxury goods, fractures. Trade routes that once carried Assyrian textiles to Anatolia and Egyptian gold to Mesopotamia fall dormant. The tin supply from the east, essential for bronze production, becomes unreliable. Entire regions depopulate. Cities that had thrived for centuries become mounds of rubble reclaimed by scrub grass and wind. Assyria does not escape. It contracts sharply, losing control of territories won by its 13th century kings. The peripheral provinces slip away. But the heartland endures. The city of Asha, protected by its position on the Tigris and sustained by rain-fed agriculture in the surrounding plains, remains inhabited. The temple of the god Asha continues to receive offerings. The king list continues unbroken, name following name through generations of diminished power. Then, around 1114 before the Common Era, a king of genuine force emerges. Tiglath-Pileser I ascends the throne and immediately campaigns outward with an energy that recalls the great conquerors before him. He pushes north into the mountains of Nairi, subduing highland peoples. He marches west, reaching the Mediterranean coast near the Phoenician cities of Byblos, Sidon, and Arvad. There, according to his own inscriptions, he rides in a ship upon the sea and hunts a narwhal. He receives tribute of cedar timber from the forested mountains of Lebanon. His royal annals, inscribed on clay prisms, record campaigns in nearly every direction. They also record something else, a passion for hunting that borders on ritual. Tiglath-Pileser I claims to have killed 4 wild bulls, 10 elephants, and over 900 lions, some from his chariot, others on foot. These hunts are not mere sport. They are demonstrations of royal power over the wild forces of nature, a tradition that will reach its artistic pinnacle centuries later under Ashurbanipal. Yet even this vigorous king cannot hold back the tide rising from the western desert. The Aramaeans, semi-nomadic peoples speaking a West Semitic language, begin migrating into Mesopotamia in waves that intensify through the late 12th and 11th centuries. They move along river valleys, settle on abandoned agricultural land, and establish tribal territories across Syria and into the Assyrian periphery. Tiglath-Pileser I records crossing the Euphrates 28 times in a single year to combat Aramaean incursions, a detail that reveals not strength but desperation. After his death around 1076 before the Common Era, the pressure becomes overwhelming. His successors fight a losing battle of containment. By 1050, Assyria has been reduced to little more than its core triangle of cities, Asha, Nineveh, and Arbela. The Aramaeans control the countryside. Trade has collapsed. Royal inscriptions become sparse, sometimes vanishing entirely for decades. Scholars call this Assyria's Dark Age. But Asha does not die. The temples function. The scribes copy texts. The king list records names even when those kings command little beyond their city walls. The god Asha watches from his sanctuary on the bluff above the Tigris, and the city that bears his name waits, diminished but unbroken, for the centuries to turn. The centuries turn. Around 934 before the Common Era, a king named Ashur-dan II ascends the throne of a kingdom that barely extends beyond its own heartland. The Aramaeans still press against Assyrian borders. The countryside lies scarred by generations of neglect. But Ashurdan does something his immediate predecessors could not. He pushes back. Year after year, his armies reclaim villages, reopen roads, resettle abandoned farmland. His inscriptions speak not of grand conquest, but of restoration. Granaries rebuilt, canals dredged, populations returned to fields that had lain fallow for decades. It is unglamorous work, the labor of survival becoming the labor of recovery. His grandson Adad-nirari II accelerates the momentum. Between 911 and 891 before the Common Era, Assyrian forces reconquer the Habur River Valley, subdue Aramaean tribal confederations, and force Babylon into a treaty that fixes the southern border. The kingdom breathes again. Tax revenues flow. Iron, the metal that has slowly replaced bronze across the Near East, now equips Assyrian soldiers with harder blades, stronger spear points, and more durable tools for siege and construction alike. The infrastructure of empire is being forged in a new metal. Then comes the king who transforms recovery into domination. Ashurnasirpal II takes the throne in 883 before the Common Era, and within his 24-year reign, Assyria becomes something the world has not seen before, a military state of systematic, calculated, and deliberately terrifying power. His royal annals, carved in cuneiform on stone slabs, describe campaigns of extraordinary violence with a precision that reads almost like accounting. Cities that resist are burned. Populations are impaled, flayed, or stacked in pyramids of severed heads at the gates of ruined towns. These are not exaggerations for posterity. They are policy, carved in stone so that every vassal who enters the throne room understands the cost of defiance. His armies march west, reaching the Mediterranean coast, where Phoenician cities offer tribute rather than face siege. They push north into the foothills, where Aramaean strongholds fall one after another. Iron-equipped infantry, cavalry units that have largely replaced the chariot as the primary mobile strike force, and sophisticated siege engines capable of breaching mud-brick fortifications give Assyria a technological edge no regional power can match. But Ashurnasirpal's ambition extends beyond warfare. He abandons Ashur as his primary residence and constructs a new capital at Nimrud, the ancient Kalhu, 30 kilometers to the north. The city covers 360 hectares, enclosed by massive mud-brick walls. At its heart rises the Northwest Palace, a sprawling complex of administrative halls, ritual chambers, and royal apartments. Its walls are lined with over 2 kilometers of carved alabaster reliefs depicting the king hunting lions, wading through marshes, besieging cities, and receiving tribute from conquered peoples. Colossal lamassu, winged bulls with human heads carved from single blocks of limestone, each weighing tens of tons, guard the principal doorways, their 5 legs creating the illusion of motion when viewed from different angles. The palace's inauguration is an event of calculated spectacle. A stone stele records the banquet in precise detail. 69,574 guests feasted for 10 days on cattle, sheep, fowl, fish, beer, and wine. Delegations from across the known world attend. The message is unmistakable. Assyria has returned, and it intends to be remembered. The reliefs in the throne room tell the deeper story. They depict not merely conquest, but cosmic order, the king as the agent of the god Ashur, maintaining the world through righteous warfare. Sacred trees flanked by winged genies represent divine blessing flowing through royal power. Every image is theology rendered in stone, empire justified in carved alabaster, and a warning written in a language that requires no translation. The empire Ashurnasirpal II forged now passes to his son. In 859 before the Common Era, Shalmaneser III ascends the throne at Nimrud and inherits the most powerful military apparatus the ancient world has yet produced. Where his father rebuilt and terrorized, Shalmaneser will campaign with a relentlessness that defines an entire generation. 31 military expeditions across a reign of 35 years, an almost annual rhythm of war that pushes Assyrian power into territories no previous king had reached. His ambitions turn first westward, toward the wealthy Aramean kingdoms of Syria and the Levantine coast. The trade routes linking Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean carry copper, cedar, dyed textiles, and ivory, wealth that Assyria intends to control. But the Western kingdoms recognize the threat. By 853 before the Common Era, an extraordinary coalition assembles near the Orontes River at a place called Karkar. Hadadezer of Damascus leads the alliance. King Ahab of Israel contributes 2,000 chariots and 10,000 infantry. Contingents arrive from Hamath, Egypt, Arab tribal confederations, and the Phoenician coast. It is the largest military coalition the Levant has ever organized against a single enemy, and it marks the first time Israel appears in any historical record outside the Hebrew Bible. Shalmaneser's own monolith inscription claims victory at Karkar, describing rivers choked with enemy dead. Yet the aftermath tells a different story. He does not advance further into the Levant that year. He returns to campaign against the same coalition repeatedly, in 849, 848, and 845 before the Common Era, suggesting that Karkar was far from the decisive triumph his scribes proclaimed. The Western kingdoms held, yet Assyrian pressure reshapes the political landscape regardless. Within a decade, dynasties fall and alliances fracture. In the Kingdom of Israel, the house of Omri collapses. A military commander named Jehu seizes the throne through bloody revolt. Around 841 before the Common Era, Jehu sends tribute to Shalmaneser, an act immortalized on the Black Obelisk, a 2-meter-tall monument of black limestone discovered at Nimrud in 1846. Its carved panels show Jehu or his emissary prostrate before the Assyrian king, offering gold, silver, and precious objects. It remains one of the most significant artifacts connecting Assyrian and biblical history. At the temple complex of Imgur-Enlil, modern Balawat, massive wooden gates stand sheathed in hammered bronze bands. Each band narrates a specific campaign in horizontal registers of extraordinary detail. Soldiers fording rivers, cities burning, tribute bearers approaching with exotic animals and precious goods. These Balawat gates constitute a visual chronicle of Shalmaneser's wars, rendered in metal with a precision that rivals the stone reliefs of Nimrud. Shalmaneser campaigns beyond the west. He pushes north into the kingdom of Urartu in the Armenian highlands, a rising power centered at Tushpa on the shores of Lake Van. He intervenes repeatedly in Babylonian affairs, supporting factions and asserting Assyrian influence over the ancient southern cities. His armies reach the shores of lakes and cross mountain passes that no Assyrian force had previously attempted. But the very scale of these campaigns strains the empire. By the final years of his reign, the aging king delegates military command to his field marshal, a powerful official called the Turtanu. In 827 before the Common Era, rebellion erupts. Shalmaneser's own son leads a revolt that engulfs 27 cities across the Assyrian heartland. The king dies in 824 before the Common Era with the empire. He expanded, now fracturing from within, the machinery of conquest turning upon itself. The rebellion does not die with Shalmaneser III. It festers. His son Shamshi-Adad V spends the first years of his reign fighting not foreign enemies, but his own brother, who commands loyalty across the Assyrian heartland. The civil war that erupted in 827 before the Common Era grinds on for years, consuming resources, shattering provincial allegiances, and exposing the fragility beneath imperial grandeur. Shamshi-Adad V eventually prevails, but only by seeking military assistance from the Babylonian king, a humiliating concession that reverses decades of Assyrian dominance over the south. The price of survival is subordination, formalized in a treaty that places Assyria in the lesser position. When Shamshi-Adad V finally consolidates power, the empire he inherits is diminished. Provincial governors who chose sides during the civil war have tasted autonomy. Many retain the armies they raised, the revenues they collected, the local loyalties they cultivated. The machinery of centralized control, so carefully assembled by Ashurnasirpal II and expanded by Shalmaneser III, begins to corrode from within. His successors fare little better. Adad-nirari III, ascending the throne around 811 before the Common Era as a young king, initially campaigns with energy, pushing into Syria and extracting tribute from Damascus. But real power increasingly resides not with the king, but with the great officials of the court. The Turtanu, the field marshal, governs vast territories as personal domains. Provincial governors erect their own palaces, commission their own inscriptions, and conduct their own diplomacy. At the city of Tel-Barsip on the Euphrates, the governor's residence rivals royal construction in scale and artistic ambition. Painted murals adorn its walls in styles that echo the carved reliefs of Nimrud, yet they celebrate not the king, but the governor himself. Through the middle decades of the 8th century before the Common Era, a succession of weak kings occupies the throne while the empire drifts toward fragmentation. Royal inscriptions grow sparse, administrative records reveal gaps and contradictions. The great imperial roads that once carried tribute caravans and military dispatches fall into disrepair across outlying provinces. Meanwhile, in the volcanic highlands north of the Assyrian heartland, a rival power reaches its zenith. The kingdom of Urartu, centered on the fortress city of Tushpa, perched above the brilliant blue waters of Lake Van, has transformed from a loose confederation of highland tribes into a formidable centralized state. Urartian kings construct massive stone fortresses across the Armenian plateau, engineer sophisticated irrigation canals that transform arid valleys into productive farmland, and forge bronze work of extraordinary refinement. Under Argishti I and his son Sarduri II, Urartu expands aggressively, absorbing territories that had once paid tribute to Assyria. Sarduri II pushes into northern Syria, threatening Assyrian vassal states and disrupting trade routes that feed the imperial economy. The contrast is stark. While Assyrian authority dissolves into competing factions, Urartu builds. Its stone-cut channels carry water across kilometers of highland terrain. Its granaries, carved into living rock, store surplus grain for garrisons stationed along fortified frontiers. Urartian inscriptions, written in cuneiform borrowed from Mesopotamian tradition, proclaim conquests and construction projects with a confidence that mirrors Assyrian royal rhetoric from a generation earlier. By the 750s before the Common Era, the Assyrian Empire exists more in name than in substance. Its heartland along the Tigris remains intact, but the vast network of tributaries and vassals has frayed beyond recognition. Governors rule as petty kings. Urartu presses from the north. Aramaean and Babylonian powers test boundaries in the south and west. The throne itself has become a prize contested by palace factions rather than a seat of unchallenged authority. The empire awaits not gradual recovery, but violent reinvention. Somewhere within the corridors of power at Nimrud, ambition stirs in a man who will seize the throne by force and remake the Assyrian state from its foundations. In 745 before the Common Era, the man seizes his moment. Tiglath-Pileser III takes the Assyrian throne through a palace coup, sweeping aside the enfeebled king Ashur-nirari V and the decayed aristocratic factions that have paralyzed the state for decades. His origins remain debated. Royal inscriptions claim legitimate descent, but the violence of his accession suggests a usurper who understood that only radical transformation could save the empire from irrelevance. He wastes no time. The hereditary governors who have ruled provinces as personal fiefdoms, building their own palaces and commanding their own loyalties, are systematically stripped of power. In their place, Tiglath-Pileser installs royally appointed officials, many of them eunuchs, the Shah Reshi class, men who by their very nature cannot found rival dynasties. These administrators serve at the king's pleasure alone. Their authority derives entirely from the throne, and it can be revoked with a single cuneiform tablet sealed in the royal chancellery at Nimrud. Provincial boundaries are redrawn, deliberately cutting across old tribal and ethnic lines to prevent any single governor from commanding a coherent population base. The army undergoes equally radical restructuring. The old system of seasonal levies drawn from landed nobility gives way to a permanent standing force, a professional military maintained year-round at state expense. Soldiers receive land grants and equipment directly from the crown. Cavalry units expand dramatically, and the integration of conquered peoples into auxiliary formations swells Assyrian ranks beyond anything previous kings could muster. This is no longer a kingdom that campaigns when harvests allow. It is a machine designed for perpetual warfare. Then comes the policy that will reshape the demographics of the ancient Near East for centuries. Mass deportation, practiced sporadically by earlier kings, becomes systematic imperial doctrine. Conquered populations are uprooted by the tens of thousands and resettled in distant provinces. Aramaeans from Syria find themselves farming in Babylonia. Chaldean clans are transplanted to the Assyrian heartland. The deportees are not enslaved, but relocated as productive subjects, their labor rebuilding devastated regions, while their displacement shatters any capacity for organized resistance. Cuneiform administrative records meticulously track these movements: how many families, how many livestock, which routes they march along royal roads maintained by corvée labor. The campaigns themselves are relentless. Tiglath-Pileser crushes the Aramaean states of Syria one by one. In 732 before the Common Era, Damascus falls. Its king Rezin is executed, and the ancient city is absorbed directly into the provincial system. That same year, the northern territories of the Kingdom of Israel are annexed. Thousands of Israelites from Galilee and Gilead are deported to Assyria. their lands repopulated with foreign settlers, a policy whose consequences echo through biblical literature for millennia. Yet his most audacious act may be his southern strategy. Rather than merely raiding Babylonia or installing puppet rulers, Tiglath-Pileser marches south and in 729 before the Common Era takes the hand of the god Marduk in the sacred New Year ceremony at Babylon. He assumes the Babylonian throne under his own name, ruling the two great Mesopotamian civilizations simultaneously. Clay tablets from Babylon record him as their legitimate king, not a foreign conqueror. The administrative tablets accumulating in palace archives at Nimrud tell the deeper story. Provincial reports flow inward with unprecedented regularity. Tax assessments, troop requisitions, intelligence dispatches from border regions, census data from newly settled deportee communities, the volume of bureaucratic documentation explodes under this reign. The Assyrian state becomes legible to itself in ways no previous Near Eastern polity has achieved. When Tiglath-Pileser III dies in 727 before the Common Era, he leaves behind something qualitatively different from what he seized. The kingdom of Ashur has become an empire in the fullest sense, centrally administered, professionally garrisoned, demographically engineered, and spanning from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf. Every subsequent Assyrian king will build upon his architecture of power, and every subsequent empire in Western Asia, from Babylon to Persia, will study and replicate the systems he forged. Shalmaneser V inherits his father's machinery of empire and immediately puts it to use. In 727 before the Common Era, he turns his attention to the Kingdom of Israel, a vassal state that has ceased paying tribute under its king Hoshea, who has made the fatal miscalculation of seeking an alliance with Egypt. The Assyrian response is swift and total. Assyrian forces march south along the coastal plain and into the hill country of Samaria, surrounding the Israelite capital and sealing it shut. The siege lasts 3 years. Samaria sits on a hill ringed by terraced slopes, its fortifications built by Omri and strengthened by Ahab generations earlier. But no walls withstand Assyrian patience. By 722 before the Common Era, the city falls. The historical record grows complicated here. Shalmaneser V dies during or shortly after the siege, and the man who claims credit for the victory is his successor, Sargon II, whose very name means the legitimate king, a title that suggests he may be anything but. Whether Sargon seizes power through palace coup or dynastic succession remains debated, but the result is unambiguous. He claims Samaria as his conquest and records the deportation of 27,290 Israelites in his royal annals. These deportees vanish into the vastness of the Assyrian Empire, resettled in the Habur River Valley, in the cities of the Medes, in distant provinces where their identity dissolves across generations. Peoples from Babylon, Cutha, and Hamath are brought to repopulate Samaria. The Kingdom of Israel, one of the 2 Hebrew monarchies, ceases to exist. The 10 northern tribes pass from history into legend. Sargon II proves far more than a conqueror of small Levantine kingdoms. He defeats the combined forces of Urartu and its allies, campaigns deep into Anatolia, subdues Babylonian revolts, and crushes the Elamite-backed resistance of Merodach-Baladan. His 8th campaign against Urartu in 714 before the Common Era penetrates the Armenian highlands, sacking the sacred temple of the god Haldi at Musasir, a blow from which Urartu never fully recovers. Yet Sargon's most enduring ambition is architectural. In 717 before the Common Era, he begins construction of an entirely new capital on virgin ground northeast of Nineveh. He names it Dur-Sharrukin, Fortress of Sargon. The city covers 300 hectares, enclosed by walls pierced by 7 monumental gates. Each gateway is flanked by colossal lamassu, winged bulls with human heads carved from single blocks of limestone, some weighing more than 40 tons, dragged from quarries along the Tigris on wooden sledges by thousands of laborers. The royal palace rises on a massive terrace at the city's northern edge, elevated above the surrounding plain. Its walls are lined with carved alabaster reliefs depicting Sargon's campaigns, his audiences with foreign dignitaries, and ritual scenes of sacred trees flanked by winged genies. A ziggurat of 7 stages spirals upward beside the palace complex, each level painted a different color. The city is planned with geometric precision: residential quarters, temples to Nabu, Sin, and Shamash, administrative buildings, all laid out on a grid that reflects the ordered cosmos Assyrian ideology demands. Deportees from across the empire provide the labor force. Aramaeans, Babylonians, Manians, and conquered peoples from a dozen provinces raise the mud brick walls and carve the stone reliefs that celebrate their own subjugation. The city is both monument and machine, designed to project imperial permanence. But Dur-Sharrukin is barely occupied when catastrophe strikes. In 705 before the Common Era, Sargon II marches north to campaign against the Cimmerians in Tabal, in central Anatolia. He falls in battle, and his body is never recovered, a devastating omen in Assyrian religious thought, where proper burial ensures peace in the afterlife. His son Sennacherib, shaken by the theological implications of his father's unrecovered corpse, abandons Dur-Sharrukin entirely. The city that consumed a decade of imperial resources and the labor of nations stands virtually empty, a ghost capital preserved in dust, waiting 25 centuries for French archaeologists to unearth its silent gates. Sennacherib inherits an empire haunted by his father's unburied corpse and a capital cursed by theological failure. He wants nothing of Dur-Sharrukin. Instead, he turns to Nineveh, an ancient city on the eastern bank of the Tigris, inhabited for millennia, but never yet elevated to supreme imperial status. Within years, he will remake it into the largest city the world has ever known. The transformation is staggering in scale. Sennacherib extends Nineveh's walls to a circuit of 12 kilometers, punctuated by 15 monumental gates, each named for an Assyrian deity. The walls rise to a height of 25 meters in places, fronted by a broad moat fed by the river Kosa. Within this perimeter, a city of over 700 hectares takes shape. Parks, temples, arsenals, residential quarters, and broad processional avenues laid out with deliberate grandeur. The population swells beyond 100,000, making Nineveh the most densely inhabited urban center on Earth. At its heart rises the structure Sennacherib himself names the Palace Without Rival. More than 70 rooms and corridors spread across the mound of Kuyunjik, their walls lined with over 2 kilometers of carved alabaster reliefs depicting conquest, ritual, engineering, and the natural world. The stone is quarried from the hills east of the Tigris, floated downriver on rafts, and carved in situ by teams of sculptors whose chisel marks remain visible on unfinished panels. Colossal lamassu flank the principal doorways, winged bulls with human heads, each cut from a single block of limestone weighing up to 30 tons. But Sennacherib's ambition extends beyond architecture. He engineers a water system of breathtaking sophistication. A network of canals stretches over 50 kilometers into the mountains northeast of Nineveh, channeling water from the river Gomel and multiple tributaries. At Yerwan, his engineers construct a stone aqueduct 280 meters long, carried on corbelled arches across a valley, a feat of hydraulic engineering that predates comparable Roman structures by centuries. This water feeds orchards, gardens, and irrigated fields within and around the city, transforming the landscape into cultivated abundance. In 701 before the Common Era, Sennacherib turns his military attention to the kingdom of Judah. The fortified city of Lachish, second in importance only to Jerusalem, becomes the target of a full-scale siege. Assyrian engineers construct a massive ramp of packed earth and stone against the city's southwestern corner, a ramp whose archaeological remains still survive at Tel ed-Duer. Battering rams roll upward under covering fire from archers and slingers. The defenders hurl torches and stones. The city falls. Sennacherib considers this victory significant enough to dedicate an entire room in his palace to its depiction. The Lachish reliefs, carved in meticulous sequential narrative, show the siege ramp under construction, the assault in progress, defenders impaled on stakes outside the walls, and long columns of Judean captives marching into exile carrying their possessions. These panels, excavated in the 19th century, now line a gallery in the British Museum, among the most detailed military narratives surviving from the ancient world. Jerusalem itself escapes destruction, though the precise circumstances remain debated across Assyrian, biblical, and archaeological sources. Sennacherib's own annals record that he shut King Hezekiah inside his capital like a bird in a cage, extracting enormous tribute but never claiming the city's capture. The final years of Sennacherib's reign darken with controversy. His destruction of Babylon in 689 before the Common Era, razing its temples, diverting canals to flood its ruins, shocks even Assyrian sensibilities, given Babylon's sacred status. The theological weight of this act haunts the dynasty. In 681 before the Common Era, Sennacherib is murdered within his own palace, struck down by his own sons in what appears to be a succession conspiracy. The assassination takes place in a temple, compounding sacrilege upon regicide. The palace without rival, barely a generation old, becomes the scene of dynastic bloodshed. Nineveh endures, magnificent and troubled, its splendor now shadowed by the violence that built it. The blood of Sennacherib has barely dried on the temple floor when the empire convulses. His sons scatter, and civil war erupts across the Assyrian heartland. But one prince moves with decisive speed. Esarhaddon, the youngest and designated heir, marches from the western provinces toward Nineveh. Within weeks, the rival brothers flee. By early 680 before the Common Era, Esarhaddon sits upon the throne, and his first act reveals the political genius that will define his reign. He turns south toward the ruins of Babylon. His father's destruction of that sacred city 9 years earlier had been a theological catastrophe. The rubble of the Esagila temple, the scattered cult statues of Marduk, the flooded canals choking with silt. All of it stands as an open wound in Mesopotamian consciousness. Esarhaddon orders the reconstruction. Thousands of laborers begin clearing debris, relaying foundations, raising mud brick walls according to ancient ground plans preserved on cuneiform tablets. New glazed bricks gleam in the southern sun. The Esagila rises again, its sanctuaries restored, its priesthoods reinstated. This is not mere generosity. It is statecraft of the highest order, binding Babylonian loyalty to the Assyrian crown through reverence rather than ruin. Yet Esarhaddon's ambitions reach far beyond Mesopotamia. The Assyrian gaze turns toward the greatest prize remaining in the ancient world. Egypt, under the 25th dynasty of Kushite pharaohs, has been meddling in Levantine affairs for decades, funding rebellions, sheltering fugitives, undermining Assyrian authority along the Mediterranean coast. In 671 before the Common Era, Esarhaddon launches his army across the Sinai, a grueling march through waterless desert that earlier campaigns had failed to survive. This time, Arab allies provide camels carrying water skins. The army emerges intact onto the Egyptian delta. The confrontation at the walls of Memphis is swift and devastating. Taharqa, the Kushite pharaoh, commands formidable forces, but Assyrian siegecraft has no equal on earth. Memphis falls. Taharqa flees south toward Thebes, wounded, his family captured. The victory stele carved to commemorate this triumph depicts Esarhaddon towering over kneeling captive kings, ropes threaded through their lips, led like animals. The empire now stretches from the Nile Delta to the Zagros Mountains, a span of nearly 3,000 kilometers, the largest territorial extent Assyria will ever achieve. Governing this colossus requires more than military force. Esarhaddon installs Assyrian loyal governors across Egypt's delta provinces and extracts oaths of allegiance from local princes. He stations garrisons at strategic points along the Nile, but Egypt is too vast, too culturally entrenched, too distant from Nineveh to hold easily. Taharqa, regrouping in Upper Egypt, begins reclaiming lost territory almost immediately. At home, Esarhaddon confronts the problem that destroyed his own family: succession. He devises an unprecedented solution. In 672 before the Common Era, he compels every vassal king and provincial governor to swear elaborate loyalty oaths to his chosen heirs. These succession treaty tablets, discovered at Nimrud, bind the signatories under terrifying divine curses to support Ashurbanipal as king of Assyria and Shamash-shum-ukin as king of Babylon. The language is meticulous, the penalties cosmic. No previous Assyrian king has attempted to engineer the future with such legal precision. Esarhaddon himself grows increasingly ill, plagued by ailments his court physicians document in anxious letters to astrologers and exorcists. Omens are consulted obsessively. Substitute king rituals are performed, where a commoner briefly sits the throne to absorb evil portents before being quietly disposed of. Despite his deteriorating health, Esarhaddon refuses to relinquish his Egyptian ambitions. Taharqa has retaken Memphis. The empire's prestige demands a response. In 669 before the Common Era, Esarhaddon marshals his forces for a second Egyptian campaign. The army sets out from Nineveh on the long road south. But somewhere along the march, likely in the Levant, Esarhaddon dies. His body is carried home. The succession plan activates precisely as designed. Ashurbanipal ascends in Nineveh, Shamash-shum-ukin in Babylon. The empire holds. For now, the machinery functions without its architect, a testament to the administrative systems Esarhaddon perfected. The twin thrones stand occupied, the treaties enforced, the vassal kings obedient. But the division of power between two brothers carries within it the seed of a war that will shake the empire to its foundations. Ashurbanipal ascends the throne in 668 before the Common Era as a king unlike any Assyria has produced. He is trained in the scribal arts, literate in Sumerian and Akkadian, schooled in divination and mathematics. His royal inscriptions boast not only of military conquest, but of his ability to read tablets from before the Great Flood, to solve complex mathematical problems, to interpret celestial omens. He is a warrior, certainly, but he is also something rarer in the ancient world, a king who reveres knowledge as an instrument of power equal to the sword. His first crisis is Egypt. Taharqa of the 25th dynasty has reclaimed the Nile Delta, humiliating Assyrian prestige. In 667 before the Common Era, Ashurbanipal dispatches his armies south. They sweep through the delta, and Taharqa retreats to Thebes, then further into Nubia, where he dies 2 years later. His successor Tantamani briefly retakes Memphis, but Ashurbanipal's response is devastating. In 663 before the Common Era, Assyrian forces march the full length of Egypt and sack Thebes, the ancient capital of pharaohs, the city Greeks will call the 100-gated. Its temples are plundered, its obelisks toppled, its treasures carried north. The destruction echoes through centuries, remembered in the Hebrew Bible as a warning to Nineveh itself. With Egypt subdued and vassals obedient from the Mediterranean to the Zagros, Ashurbanipal turns to his consuming passion. Within the walls of his north palace at Nineveh, he constructs something unprecedented, a systematic collection of the written knowledge of Mesopotamia. Scribes are dispatched to temples and archives across Babylonia, Borsippa, Nippur, and Uruk, with royal orders to copy or confiscate tablets. They bring back thousands of texts, and palace workshops produce fresh copies on fine clay, each tablet stamped with a colophon, identifying it as property of Ashurbanipal's collection. The library grows to over 30,000 tablets and fragments, organized by subject in dedicated chambers. Medical texts catalogue symptoms and treatments. Astronomical observations record the movements of planets and the timing of eclipses. Lexical lists preserve the dying Sumerian language alongside Akkadian translations. Ritual incantations guard against demons and disease. And among these shelves rests the most extraordinary literary survival of the ancient world, the 12 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, including the 11th tablet describing a great flood sent by the gods, a narrative that will stun the modern world when deciphered over 2 millennia later. This is not mere collection. It is an act of imperial intellect. Knowledge of omens means knowledge of the future. Knowledge of rituals means control over divine favor. The library makes Nineveh the intellectual capital of the known world, a repository of wisdom stretching back 2,000 years. Yet Ashurbanipal is no cloistered scholar. The walls of his north palace bear carved alabaster reliefs of astonishing artistry depicting the royal lion hunt. These panels show the king drawing his bow from horseback, grasping a lion by its mane, plunging a sword into a rearing beast. The dying lions are rendered with extraordinary naturalism, muscles straining, mouths open in agony, hind legs collapsing. These are not crude propaganda. They are masterworks of observation, among the finest sculptural achievements of any ancient civilization. The hunts take place in controlled arenas, with lions released from cages, but the symbolism is ancient and sacred. The king who masters the lion masters chaos itself. proving his fitness to rule on behalf of the god Ashur. In these years between 668 and 650 before the Common Era, the empire reaches a paradoxical zenith. Its territory stretches from the Nile to the mountains of Elam. Its capital houses the greatest archive of human knowledge yet assembled. Its art achieves a refinement that will not be surpassed in the Near East for centuries. Ashurbanipal presides over a civilization at the absolute peak of its cultural and military power. But the twin thrones his father designed, one brother in Nineveh, one in Babylon, have begun to generate friction that no library of omens can resolve. The empire that stretches from the Nile to the Zagros does not hold itself together through diplomacy alone. It holds itself together through a military apparatus so sophisticated, so deliberately terrifying, that its reputation precedes every army column by weeks. The machinery of Assyrian warfare, refined across 2.5 centuries of Neo-Assyrian expansion, represents the most advanced instrument of organized violence the ancient world has ever produced. At its peak under Ashurbanipal, the standing army numbers between 150,000 and 200,000 men, a force unmatched by any contemporary power. This is not a seasonal militia of farmers called from their fields. Tiglath-Pileser III's reforms have created a permanent professional military, maintained year-round, trained in specialized units, and equipped from centralized royal arsenals. The arsenal at Nimrud, known as the Ekal Masharti, covers an area of nearly 7 hectares, its storerooms filled with iron swords, spearheads, helmets, and scale armor fashioned from hundreds of small bronze or iron plates laced together with leather cord. Iron transforms everything. Where bronze weapons bend and dull, iron holds its edge. Assyrian smiths master carburization techniques that harden iron blades to a quality no rival can consistently match. Every infantryman carries an iron-tipped spear. Archers wield composite bows of wood, horn, and sinew capable of launching arrows over 300 meters. The cavalry arm evolves dramatically across these centuries. Under Ashurnasirpal II, chariots still dominate the battlefield. Heavy platforms carrying a driver, archer, and shield-bearer. By the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, mounted cavalry increasingly replaces chariotry, offering speed and flexibility across terrain where wheeled vehicles cannot follow. Riders learn to control their horses with leg pressure alone, freeing both hands for the bow. But the Assyrian army's most devastating capability is siege warfare. The Royal Corps of Engineers accompanies every major campaign, constructing earthen ramps against city walls, sometimes hundreds of meters long. At Lachish in 701 before the Common Era, Sennacherib's engineers build a massive siege ramp of packed earth and stone still visible today. An engineering feat requiring thousands of laborers working under arrow fire. Battering rams mounted on wheeled wooden frames, covered with dampened hides against fire, pound gates and walls while sappers tunnel beneath foundations. The reliefs carved across palace walls at Nimrud and Nineveh document these techniques with clinical precision. They also document what follows victory. Ashurnasirpal II's inscriptions describe captives impaled on stakes outside conquered cities, flayed skins draped over walls, pyramids of severed heads stacked beside gates. These are not merely acts of cruelty. They constitute a deliberate imperial strategy, calculated psychological warfare designed to make resistance unthinkable. Cities that surrender receive terms. Cities that resist receive annihilation. Mass deportation operates on the same logic. Entire populations, men, women, children, march hundreds of kilometers from their homelands to distant provinces, their communities shattered and reassembled where they pose no threat. The reliefs show these processions in haunting detail. Families carrying bundles on their backs, children riding on parents' shoulders, ox carts loaded with possessions, all moving under the watchful eyes of Assyrian soldiers. Every carved panel in every palace serves a purpose beyond decoration. Foreign ambassadors and vassal kings walk through corridors lined with these images on their way to the throne room. They see cities burning, armies crushed, kings led on leashes. The message requires no translation. The walls themselves are weapons, and the empire speaks most fluently in the language of calculated, magnificent, and meticulously documented force. Behind every carved panel of conquest, behind every iron blade and siege ramp, stands a god. The force that drives Assyrian armies across the known world is not merely royal ambition. It is divine command. The god Ashur demands expansion, and the king, his chosen instrument, obeys. In the earliest centuries of the city's existence, Ashur is simply a local deity, inseparable from the settlement that bears his name on the western bank of the Tigris. His temple, the Ashara, rises from the limestone bluff overlooking the river, a modest structure of mud brick and timber that serves as the spiritual nucleus of a trading community. Ishtar, goddess of war and desire, holds her own sanctuary nearby, one of the oldest cult sites in the city. These two deities anchor Assyrian religious life from its inception, but their natures transform as the civilization itself transforms. As Assyria grows from city-state to territorial kingdom to empire, Ashur ascends correspondingly. He absorbs the attributes of Enlil, the supreme god of the older Sumerian pantheon, becoming lord of all lands and father of the gods. By the Neo-Assyrian period, Ashur stands alone at the apex of a vast divine hierarchy, his winged disk symbol hovering over kings in every major relief. He is no longer merely a city god. He is the cosmic sovereign whose will shapes the destiny of nations. Every military campaign is launched in his name. Every conquered territory is absorbed into his domain. To resist Assyria is to resist Ashur himself, and the theological implications of that resistance justify annihilation. The Akitu festival, celebrated at the spring New Year, ritually renews this covenant between God and king. Processions move through the streets of Ashur, past the double ziggurat that rises in stepped tiers of mud brick above the city, its summit crowned with a shrine where heaven meets earth. The king takes the hand of Ashur's statue, symbolically receiving his mandate to rule for another year. Without this ceremony, kingship itself lacks legitimacy. Divination saturates every level of state decision-making. The Baru priests, specialists in extispacy, slaughter sheep and examine their livers with extraordinary precision, comparing the organs' folds and markings against clay models inscribed with centuries of accumulated interpretive tradition. These clay liver models, some dating to the old Babylonian period, serve as textbooks for apprentice diviners. No major military campaign begins, no treaty is signed, no building is inaugurated without consulting the entrails. Astrologers scan the night sky from temple rooftops, recording the movements of planets and the appearances of eclipses on tablets sent directly to the king. Hundreds of these reports survive from the reigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, revealing a court that governs by celestial omen as much as by intelligence report. The Ashipu, the exorcist priest, combats the demons and malevolent spirits that Assyrians believe cause disease, madness, and misfortune. Armed with incantations, ritual figurines, and purification rites, the Ashipu operates at the intersection of medicine and theology. Cuneiform tablets from Ashurbanipal's library preserve thousands of these incantation texts, organized into canonical series passed down through generations of scribal training. Prophetic oracles also reach the throne. During Esarhaddon's anxious reign, female and male prophets deliver messages from Ishtar of Arbela, assuring the king of divine protection and victory. These oracles, collected on tablets now housed in museums, represent some of the most intimate surviving documents of ancient religious experience, voices speaking with the authority of a goddess to a king desperate for reassurance. The temples themselves are economic powerhouses, controlling vast agricultural estates, employing hundreds of workers, and managing their own treasuries. The priesthood forms a parallel hierarchy to the royal administration, and the great temples of Ashur, Ishtar, and Nabu accumulate wealth across centuries. Religion in Assyria is never a private matter. It is the architecture of power itself, the invisible scaffolding upon which the visible empire stands. And when that scaffolding eventually cracks, the empire built upon it will prove to have no foundation at all. Beneath the colossal reliefs and the thunder of imperial armies, millions of ordinary lives unfold in rhythms dictated not by conquest, but by season, soil, and the slow turning of the agricultural year. The Neo-Assyrian heartland stretches across the undulating plains between the Tigris and the Upper Zab, a landscape of rain-fed wheat fields in the north, giving way to irrigated barley plots along the canal networks that lace the southern reaches of the kingdom. Farmers rise before dawn, working plots assigned by the crown or by temple estates, measuring their harvests in units of grain against obligations of tax and tithe. Barley is the staple, ground into coarse flour for flatbread or fermented into beer, the daily drink consumed by laborers, priests, and palace officials alike. Sesame provides oil for cooking and lamp fuel. Date palms cluster along watercourses further south, their fruit dried and pressed into syrup that sweetens an otherwise austere diet. The canal systems that sustain this agriculture represent generations of collective labor. Channels cut from the Tigris feed networks of secondary and tertiary ditches, regulated by sluice gates that local overseers manage according to royal decree. Failure to maintain a canal segment brings legal penalties documented in administrative tablets. The fields themselves are plowed with iron-tipped wooden plows drawn by oxen, a technology that gives Assyrian agriculture an edge over regions still reliant on bronze. In the cities, craftsmen occupy distinct quarters. Metalworkers hammer iron into blades, arrowheads, and agricultural tools in workshops heated by bellows-driven furnaces. Glazed brick production requires precise control of kiln temperatures, and the artisans who master this technique produce the luminous blue and yellow panels that adorn palace facades. Textile workers, many of them women, spin wool and weave fabrics on horizontal looms, producing garments that range from coarse laborer tunics to the elaborately fringed robes depicted on royal reliefs. Women in Assyrian society occupy a legally circumscribed world. The Middle Assyrian laws, compiled centuries earlier but still influential, mandate that married women and concubines wear veils in public, while slaves and prostitutes are forbidden from veiling under penalty of flogging. Marriage contracts inscribed on clay tablets specify bride prices, dowry inventories, and conditions for divorce. Women manage household economies, oversee domestic slaves, and in some cases conduct business transactions documented in their own sealed correspondence. Adoption contracts reveal a society anxious about inheritance, with childless couples formalizing the adoption of heirs through witnessed legal ceremonies. The social hierarchy descends from the king through a nobility of military officers and provincial governors, past a broad class of free landholders and merchants, down to dependent laborers and slaves. Slaves are acquired through war, debt default, or birth, and their legal status is meticulously recorded. They labor on royal construction projects, haul stone for palace walls, and work temple agricultural estates. Yet even slaves possess limited legal protections, and manumission documents show that freedom can be purchased or granted. Commerce flows along imperial roads maintained by the state. Merchants transport metals, textiles, wine, and luxury goods across distances measured in stages between royal way stations. The shekel of silver serves as the standard unit of value, weighed on balance scales against standardized stone weights shaped like sleeping ducks. Transactions are recorded on clay tablets, sealed and stored in household archives that survive by the thousands. Food preparation centers on communal ovens where flatbread bakes against heated clay walls. Stews of lentils, onions, and occasional mutton simmer in wide-mouthed ceramic vessels. Beer is brewed in household quantities, filtered through reed straws, and consumed at every meal. The residential quarters excavated at Nimrud reveal modest courtyard houses with packed earth floors, storage rooms lined with ceramic jars, and small domestic shrines where family rituals honor household deities. Life in these rooms is intimate, constrained, and governed by rhythms that the palace reliefs never depict. The quiet labor of millions whose hands build and feed an empire that records only the deeds of kings. The empire builds itself from earth. Every wall, every platform, every palace foundation begins with mud drawn from the riverbanks and mixed with chopped straw, pressed into wooden molds and dried under the relentless Mesopotamian sun. Millions of these bricks rise into the great capitals, stacked in courses bonded with bitumen mortar, forming walls of staggering thickness. At Dur Sharukin, the fortification walls measure 24 meters thick at their base, massive enough to absorb the impact of any battering ram yet devised. The mud brick is the empire's most humble material and its most essential, shaped by the hands of conscripted laborers and war captives working in organized gangs under the supervision of royal engineers whose titles appear in administrative tablets. But mud brick alone cannot convey divine authority. For that, the Assyrians turned to stone. Limestone and alabaster quarries along the upper Tigris yield enormous blocks destined to become the Lamassu, those colossal winged bulls with human heads that guard palace gateways. Some weigh 40 tons. Palace reliefs depict the extraordinary logistics of their transport, teams of hundreds hauling the rough-carved figures on wooden sledges along prepared tracks, ropes straining over wooden levers, water poured beneath the runners to reduce friction. The journey from quarry to palace gate can span weeks. Once positioned, master sculptors complete the fine carving in place, rendering curled beards, feathered wings, and muscled flanks with astonishing precision. Inside the palaces, the decorative program reaches a scale unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. Sennacherib's palace without rival at Nineveh contains over 70 rooms, their walls lined with carved alabaster panels stretching more than 2 kilometers in total length. Every surface tells a story. Military campaigns unfold in sequential narrative. Siege engines breach enemy walls. Prisoners march in long processions. Royal lion hunts display the king's mastery over chaos. The reliefs are carved in low relief with extraordinary attention to anatomical detail, then painted in vivid reds, blues, and blacks that time has stripped away, leaving only the pale stone. The urban planning of these capitals reflects deliberate imperial ideology. Sargon II conceives Dur-Sharrukin as a perfect expression of cosmic order. The city covers 300 hectares, its walls forming a near-perfect rectangle oriented to the cardinal directions. The royal citadel sits on a raised platform at the northwest, straddling the city wall itself, elevated above both the urban population and the world beyond. Temples to Nabu, Sin, Shamash, and Adad cluster within the citadel precinct. A ziggurat of 7 stages rises beside the palace, its spiral ramp ascending toward the heavens. Sennacherib's transformation of Nineveh surpasses even his father's ambition. The city's walls extend 12 kilometers, pierced by 15 monumental gates. But his most remarkable achievement lies in hydraulic engineering. The canal system he commissions brings water from mountain springs over 50 kilometers away, feeding orchards, gardens, and the city's growing population. At Jawan, the canal crosses a limestone valley on an aqueduct 280 meters long, built with corbelled stone arches and waterproofed with bitumen. An inscription carved into its stones credits Sennacherib with divine inspiration for its design. This structure predates comparable Roman aqueducts by centuries. The integration of architecture, sculpture, engineering, and urban design into a single coherent program of imperial expression has no precedent. Each capital surpasses the last, each king determined to eclipse his predecessor in scale and splendor. The cities rise from the alluvial plain as deliberate statements of permanent power, their stone guardians staring outward across the empire's roads, their carved walls preserving the narrative of conquest for eternity. Yet every one of these monuments rests on foundations of sun-dried mud, and the empire's engineers understand what later centuries will confirm, that even the mightiest walls return, eventually, to the earth from which they came. The arrangement that Esarhaddon devises for his succession is elegant in theory and catastrophic in practice. Before his death in 669 before the Common Era, he divides the empire between 2 sons. Ashurbanipal receives the throne of Assyria and supreme authority over the realm. His elder brother Shamash-Shum-Ukin receives the throne of Babylon, ruling the ancient sacred city as a subordinate king bound by oath to Nineveh. Vassal treaties inscribed on clay tablets and sworn before the gods compel every provincial governor and allied ruler to uphold this dual arrangement. For over a decade, the system holds. Shamash-Shum-Ukin performs the rituals of Babylonian kingship, grasps the hands of the god Marduk at the New Year festival, and governs the wealthy southern provinces. But the arrangement contains a fundamental humiliation. Babylon, the most prestigious city in Mesopotamia, is ruled by a king who must defer to his younger brother in distant Nineveh. Every diplomatic exchange reinforces the subordination. Every royal decree from Ashurbanipal that overrides Babylonian policy deepens the resentment. In 652 before the Common Era, Shamash-shum-ukin revolts. The coalition he assembles reveals how many enemies Assyria has accumulated across generations of conquest. Elamite armies from the Zagros foothills pledge their forces. Arab tribal confederations from the western desert join. Egyptian agents offer support. Chaldean and Aramaean communities throughout southern Mesopotamia rally to Babylon's cause. The rebellion stretches across the entire southern and eastern arc of the empire, threatening to sever Assyria from its richest provinces. Ashurbanipal responds with methodical, devastating force. Rather than storming Babylon's massive fortifications directly, Assyrian forces encircle the city and seal every gate, every canal, every road. The siege begins and does not relent. Cuneiform letters from inside the city, recovered centuries later by archaeologists, describe conditions of unimaginable suffering. Famine consumes the population. The price of grain rises beyond any measure. Reports describe inhabitants eating leather, then worse. Disease follows starvation through the crowded streets. For 4 years the blockade holds, from 652 to 648 before the Common Era, while Assyrian field armies systematically defeat the allied forces attempting to relieve the city. Babylon falls in 648. Shamash-shum-ukin dies in the conflagration of his own palace, whether by enemy action or by his own hand remains uncertain. The ancient chronicles record flames consuming the royal residence as the city's defenses collapse. Ashurbanipal enters Babylon not as a liberator, but as a conqueror, reclaiming what was always his. He purifies the temples, restores the cult of Marduk, and presents himself as the restorer of divine order. The propaganda is precise and deliberate. But the vengeance does not end at Babylon's walls. Ashurbanipal turns east toward Elam, the most persistent supporter of the rebellion. Assyrian armies push through the marshlands and mountain passes of southwestern Iran. In 647 before the Common Era, they reach Susa, the ancient Elamite capital, a city whose history stretches back millennia. The destruction is systematic and total. Temples are demolished, royal tombs are opened, and the bones of Elamite kings dragged into the light, denied rest in the afterworld. Sacred groves assaulted. The ziggurat is torn down. Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions boast of carrying away the accumulated treasures of centuries and silencing the land so that the voices of its people and the sounds of its cattle vanish from its fields. The victory is complete but Pyrrhic. The 4-year siege has drained the imperial treasury. The destruction of Elam removes a buffer state that had, despite its hostility, absorbed pressures from the Iranian plateau. The Babylonian provinces, devastated by famine and war, will take decades to recover their agricultural productivity. The empire emerges from the Brothers' War militarily triumphant, but structurally weakened, its resources spent, its subject populations embittered, and the vast eastern frontier now open to new peoples, gathering strength in the mountains beyond the ruined cities of Elam. Ashurbanipal dies around 631 before the Common Era, and the silence that follows is unlike anything in Assyrian history. The royal annals, those meticulous records that had documented every campaign and every tribute for centuries, simply stop. The scribes who had filled Nineveh's library with tens of thousands of tablets produce almost nothing. It is as though the empire's voice has been cut from its throat. What fragments survive reveal a kingdom devouring itself. Ashur-etil-ilani, likely Ashurbanipal's son, claims the throne, but faces immediate challenge from a general named Sin-shumu-lishir, and from his own brother, Sin-shar-ishkun. The succession crisis that Esarhaddon had tried so carefully to prevent with his loyalty treaties repeats itself with devastating precision. The court at Nineveh fractures into competing factions. Provincial governors, watching the center tear itself apart, begin calculating their own interests. The provincial system that Tiglath-Pileser III had designed with such brilliance depends entirely on a strong king enforcing loyalty through appointed officials, regular inspections, and the ever-present threat of military punishment. Without that central authority, the system unravels with astonishing speed. Governors who had been rotated to prevent them from building local power bases now find no one rotating them at all. The intelligence network that had reported dissent to the royal court falls silent. The imperial roads that had carried armies to suppress rebellion carry no armies now. In Babylon, a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar exploits the chaos with calculated patience. By 626 before the Common Era, he has seized the city and declared himself king of Babylon, formally ending Assyrian control over southern Mesopotamia. The Babylonian chronicles, written from his perspective, record his early campaigns against Assyrian garrisons along the Euphrates and Tigris. The fighting is bitter and inconclusive at first, with Assyrian forces still capable of counterattacks that push Nabopolassar back from contested cities. But each year, the balance shifts. Far to the east, beyond the ruins of Elam that Ashurbanipal had so thoroughly destroyed, a power consolidates that the Assyrians had long regarded as a peripheral threat. The Medes, an Iranian people centered at Ecbatana in the Zagros highlands, unite under Cyaxares. He reorganizes Median tribal warriors into a disciplined army structured by weapon type rather than clan affiliation. The vacuum left by Elam's annihilation, that buffer state whose destruction had seemed so triumphant barely 2 decades earlier, now allows Median power to expand unchecked across the Iranian plateau, directly toward Assyria's eastern frontier. Sin-shar-ishkun, who eventually secures the Assyrian throne, proves a capable but overwhelmed ruler, fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. Babylonian pressure from the south, Median encroachment from the east, and the defection of formerly loyal vassal states reduce the empire month by month. The Scythian nomads who roam the northern periphery shift their allegiances opportunistically. In 614 before the Common Era, Cyaxares leads his Median army westward and strikes not at a border fortress or a provincial capital, but at Ashur itself, the ancient city on the Tigris where the civilization had been born more than 18 centuries earlier. The city whose god had given his name to the empire, whose temples had sanctified every conquest, whose king list stretched back to rulers who lived in tents, falls to foreign soldiers. The temples of Ashur and Ishtar, maintained through every previous crisis, through Mitanni domination and Bronze Age collapse and Aramaean encirclement, burn. Nabopolassar arrives after the city has already fallen and meets Cyaxares amid the smoking ruins. The two kings seal their alliance with a dynastic marriage, binding Median and Babylonian royal houses together in a pact aimed at one final target. Nineveh still stands, its 12 kilometers of walls and 15 gates intact, its palaces filled with the accumulated splendor of 3 centuries of empire. Sin-shar-ishkun gathers what forces remain within those walls, but the spiritual heart of Assyria is already ash drifting above the Tigris. 2 years pass between the destruction of Ashur and the assault on Nineveh. The coalition that burned the spiritual capital now turns its full weight against the administrative and military heart of the empire. In the spring of 612 before the Common Era, Nabopolassar's Babylonian forces march north along the Tigris, while Cyaxares leads Median armies westward from the Zagros. Scythian horsemen, allied with the Medes, sweep across the upper plains. The Babylonian chronicles, preserved on the cuneiform tablet catalogued as British Museum 21901, record the convergence with terse precision. 3 armies close on a single city. Nineveh, in these final months, remains immense. Its walls stretch 12 kilometers around a city that still holds tens of thousands of inhabitants. 15 monumental gates pierce the fortifications, each flanked by carved guardian figures. The palace without rival, Sennacherib's masterwork, stands on its raised platform above the Kosa River, its 70 rooms lined with alabaster panels depicting conquests that now belong to a vanishing world. Sin-shar-ishkun commands the defense from within these walls, but the provincial armies that once reinforced Assyrian kings no longer answer the call. The empire has contracted to the city itself. The siege begins in earnest as summer heat settles over the plain. The coalition forces encircle the walls and cut supply lines from every direction. For approximately 3 months, Nineveh holds. Then the Tigris and the Sosa, swollen by unusually heavy seasonal rains, rise against the city they once sustained. Floodwaters undermine sections of the massive mud-brick fortifications, softening foundations and collapsing stretches of wall that no battering ram could breach. The prophet Nahum's oracle, composed perhaps in anticipation of this very moment, speaks of river gates thrown open and the palace dissolving. Whether prophecy or observation, the waters do what armies alone cannot. Through the breaches pour Babylonian infantry and Median warriors. The fighting moves through streets that Sennacherib had widened and paved, past temples where priests of Ishtar and Nabu had performed rituals for centuries. Sin-shar-ishkun retreats to his palace. According to later tradition preserved in Greek sources, the last king of Nineveh perishes in flames he sets himself, choosing destruction over capture. The Babylonian chronicles note simply that a great defeat was inflicted, and the city fell. The palace without rival burns. Ashurbanipal's library, those 30,000 tablets of accumulated wisdom, collapses into the rubble, paradoxically preserved by the very fire that destroys the building, as baked clay endures where unbaked clay dissolves. The sack of Nineveh sends shockwaves across the ancient world. The city that had terrorized nations for 3 centuries becomes a ruin almost overnight. But Assyria does not die in a single night. A remnant court coalesces around Ashurbanipal II, who may be a general or a minor royal. He establishes a government in exile at Haran, 600 kilometers to the west, the ancient city sacred to the moon god Sin. For 2 years this ghost of empire persists, sustained by a remarkable ally, Egypt. Pharaoh Necho II, recognizing that Babylonian dominance threatens Egyptian interests, dispatches forces to support the Assyrian remnant. It is not enough. In 610 before the Common Era, Nabopolassar's armies take Haran. Ashurbanipal II retreats across the Euphrates. The following year, in 609, he launches a final counterattack with Egyptian support, attempting to recapture the city. The assault fails. The Babylonian chronicles record the retreat without elaboration. After this moment, Ashurbanipal II vanishes from every historical record. No death is documented, no tomb identified, no final inscription carved. The empire that had maintained the longest king list in Mesopotamian history, that had built 4 successive capitals, each grander than the last, that had conquered from the Nile Delta to the mountains of Elam, ceases to exist as a political entity. Nineveh's ruins settle into mounds of earth that local populations will eventually farm. Within 2 generations, the Greek soldier Xenophon will march past these mounds and record that no one can tell him who built them. The empire vanishes, but its architecture of power does not. Within a single generation of Nineveh's destruction, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II govern their territories using provincial structures inherited directly from Assyrian administration. The satrapy system, the network of royal messengers, the practice of deporting conquered populations to break regional resistance, these are Assyrian innovations that Babylon adopts wholesale, and that Persia, rising from the Iranian plateau under Cyrus the Great, will refine into the governing framework of the largest empire the world has yet known. At Persepolis, constructed beginning around 515 before the Common Era, the architectural debt is visible in stone. Colossal winged bulls guard doorways in conscious imitation of Assyrian lamassu. Tribute processions carved in relief along the Apadana staircase echo the compositional grammar of Assyrian palace art, the ordered rows of subject peoples, the careful differentiation of ethnic costume, the king elevated above all. The royal road stretching from Sardis to Susa follows routes that Assyrian couriers once traveled. Darius I divides his empire into provinces governed by appointed officials answerable to the crown, a system Tiglath-Pileser III had pioneered 2 centuries earlier. Greek writers encounter Assyria as legend. Herodotus attributes the founding of Nineveh to a figure named Ninus. Ctesias of Cnidus, physician at the Persian court around 400 before the Common Era, spins elaborate tales of the Queen Semiramis, a distorted memory of the historical Samuramat, regent of Assyria around 811 before the Common Era. These accounts, fantastical and unreliable, nevertheless preserve Assyria in Western memory through centuries, when the cuneiform script itself becomes unreadable, and the mounds covering Nineveh and Nimrud lie silent under fields of grain. 24 centuries of silence end in 1845, when Austen Henry Layard, a young British adventurer, sinks trenches into the mound of Nimrud. Within days, his workers uncover carved alabaster panels depicting scenes of war and royal ceremony. Colossal lamassu emerge from the earth, winged bulls with human faces, still bearing traces of original pigment, staring outward with expressions of serene authority after millennia underground. The excavation electrifies Victorian England. Crates of reliefs travel by raft down the Tigris, by ship through the Persian Gulf, and arrive at the British Museum, where they remain today. Layard moves to Nineveh's mound of Kuyunjik, uncovering Sennacherib's palace without rival. But the most transformative discovery comes later. In 1853, Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian-born archaeologist from Mosul working alongside Layard, uncovers the remains of Ashurbanipal's library, thousands of cuneiform tablets buried in the palace ruins. In 1872, George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist at the British Museum, translates a tablet describing a great flood, a boat, and the survival of one righteous man. The text predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years. Smith's public reading of the flood tablet causes a sensation that reshapes understanding of ancient history and biblical origins. The tablets keep yielding knowledge. Medical prescriptions, astronomical observations recording eclipses with precision, mathematical tables, diplomatic correspondence, and the complete text of the Epic of Gilgamesh emerge from Ashurbanipal's collection. The library proves to be exactly what its creator intended, an archive of all Mesopotamian knowledge, preserved through catastrophe by the very fire that destroyed the palace, which baked the clay tablets into permanence. Roman imperial administration, though developed independently in many respects, mirrors Assyrian precedents in its provincial governance, military roads, and use of deportation and colonization to pacify conquered regions. The very concept of empire as a multi-ethnic state held together by infrastructure, bureaucracy, and overwhelming military force finds its earliest full expression in the Assyrian model. Every empire that follows inherits something from that template, whether consciously or through chains of transmission stretching back through Persia and Babylon to the throne rooms of Nimrud and Nineveh, where the principles were first carved in stone. The empire falls, but the people do not vanish. In the centuries following 612 before the Common Era, the population of northern Mesopotamia continues to speak Aramaic, the language that Assyria itself had adopted as its administrative tongue during the final imperial centuries. Villages persist in the Nineveh Plains, in the Hakkari Mountains of southeastern Turkey, and across the upper reaches of the Tigris. When Christianity spreads eastward in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, these communities embrace it early, establishing the Church of the East, which sends missionaries as far as China and India along the Silk Road. Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic written in a flowing script, becomes the liturgical language of these Christians, preserving linguistic continuity, stretching back to the days when Assyrian scribes first adopted Aramaic alongside cuneiform. In the Tur Abdin Plateau of southeastern Turkey, monasteries carved from golden limestone shelter monks who copy manuscripts through centuries of shifting imperial control, Roman, Sasanian, Arab, Ottoman. The monastery of Mor Gabriel, founded in 397 of the Common Era, still stands, its walls enclosing over 1,600 years of continuous worship. These communities identify themselves as Assyrians, Syriacs, or Chaldeans, names reflecting ecclesiastical divisions but pointing toward a shared heritage rooted in the land between the Tigris and the Zagros. The 20th century brings catastrophe. During the First World War, Ottoman forces and allied Kurdish irregulars carry out systematic massacres against Assyrian Christians in what survivors call Seyfo, the sword. Between 1914 and 1920, an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 Assyrians perish. Entire villages in Hakkari and the Tur Abdin are emptied. Survivors flee to refugee camps in British-controlled Iraq, where they settle uneasily under a new political order that offers no homeland. The cycle of displacement continues. The Semele massacre of 1933 in northern Iraq kills hundreds. The Ba'athist campaigns of the late 20th century target Assyrian villages alongside Kurdish ones. The American invasion of 2003 unleashes sectarian violence that drives hundreds of thousands of Assyrian Christians from Baghdad and Mosul. By the early 21st century, the Assyrian population in Iraq has fallen from over 1 million to fewer than 300,000. Then comes the devastation that the world witnesses on video. In 2015, fighters of the Islamic State take sledgehammers and bulldozers to the ruins of Nimrud, toppling lamassu that have stood for nearly 3,000 years. At the Mosul Museum, they destroy Assyrian sculptures. At Nineveh, they detonate the Mashki Gate and the Adad Gate. The destruction is deliberate, theatrical, aimed at erasing the physical memory of a civilization from its own homeland. Yet the response is equally determined. International teams, including Iraqi archaeologists who risk their lives, begin documentation and restoration. UNESCO launches projects to rebuild the Mashki Gate. Three-dimensional scanning preserves digital records of artifacts before and after destruction. Assyrian diaspora communities, now numbering between 3 and 5 million across the United States, Sweden, Australia, Germany, and beyond, maintain language schools, cultural festivals, and churches where Neo-Aramaic is spoken by children whose grandparents fled Mosul or Hakkari. The Assyrian flag, bearing the winged sun disk drawn from ancient reliefs, flies at gatherings from Chicago to Sydney. Akitu, the New Year festival whose roots reach back to Sumerian Mesopotamia, is celebrated each spring. Scholars at institutions worldwide continue deciphering the tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that Ashurbanipal's library preserved, finding new medical texts, astronomical records, and literary works that reshape understanding of human intellectual history. The civilization that carved its story in stone and pressed it into clay endures, not as a relic, but as a living inheritance carried forward by those who refuse to let the oldest continuous cultural identity in Mesopotamia disappear into silence. Thank you for joining this journey through the complete story of Assyria. If these episodes have brought the ancient world closer, consider subscribing so you never miss the next civilization we bring to life.